All right, so here we are, October meeting of Mount Diablo Audubon Society. So just some reminders for Zoom. You can stay on mute and you can keep your video off if you want. That does save bandwidth and energy. And if you want to change the views, you've got that option in the top right corner. You can click on that icon that says view, and then you can change to speaker or gallery or immersive. I'm not sure what immersive means. And we are recording, and so I'll be posting this recording on our website later this week. And then if you want to ask any questions, you've got the chat. That's the button in the middle on the bottom. So what we'll do is we'll have announcements from board members, and then we'll have our speaker go. So first, I'm going to pass it over to Jerry Britton, our president.
Okay, thank you, Ariana, and welcome everybody. I see we've got 27 participants now, and I think it will grow pretty rapidly in the next few minutes. So again, thank you for attending. By the way, this is going to be our last Zoom meeting for a little while. The problem is that we are going to be jumping around. It's because we initially scheduled to have all our meetings at the Heather Farms Gardens again, but they are way behind on their remodel. So that's not unavailable. So we're going to be at the Lafayette Library next for the November meeting. The details will be in the Quail, of course, but please keep that in mind. It'll be a new venue for us. And in December, we're going to be at the Walnut Creek Civic Center, downtown Walnut Creek. Again, that's a new venue for us. But we have been scrambling to find a place that hasn't already been booked since we got a late scratch on our previous plans. So bear with us as we kind of struggle through this, and hopefully we'll be settled into the Heather Farms Gardens Camellia Room starting in 2024. I've got an announcement about the voting. About 5 days ago, the ballot was sent out about the name change for our organization. I want to say thank you to everybody who voted and encourage everybody who's not to please check your email, and on the 1st, it was sent, and go ahead and vote on an issue such as this. It's very important that we get everybody's feedback, and we're going to send another reminder in a few days, and the voting will officially end on the 15th, and we're going to announce the results of the vote in our November in-person meeting in Lafayette Library. Again, we're voting on whether we're going to change our name, and the second ballot is if we're going to change our name to Mount Diablo Bird Alliance, yes or no. So please vote. Another announcement: the Christmas counts have been scheduled. The Saturday Central County Christmas count is December 16th on a Saturday, and the East County count is the following Wednesday on the 20th. And so if anybody would like to participate, we encourage each and everyone to do so. And please go on our website and go on About Us. You'll see our board. Just email me, president@mountdiabloaudubon.org, and express your interest on either one or both of the counts, and we'll get you signed up. Most of our participation is in the field, but we love to have people contributing through feeder watches at their house and their property. Finally, Alan Baday, who's a board member, of course, is not going to be here tonight. He asked me to remind people that there's a symposium, the Contra Costa Watershed Symposium is October 26th. We're looking for people to help table at our table at this event, and we will pay for your $45 registration fee if you want to do so. So please contact, again, if you go to the About Us and board member at mountdiabloaudubon.org, you'll see Alan Baday listed. Click on his contact information and email him, and he will gladly set you up to schedule you for this symposium. There should be a lot of interesting talks, and there's also field trips involved to some of the new parks that the watershed is helping to set up. There's one out in West Oakley by the Delta, for instance, that looks very promising for birds. I think that's all my announcements, so I will send it back to Ariana and thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. And now we have former board member, longtime field trip chair, Hugh Harvey.
Hi, thanks. Good evening, everybody. You may remember that when I was the field trip chair, that in September I would make an announcement of how many trips we had made, how many species we had seen or heard throughout the year. And towards the end, the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, I would also count to see who participated in the most field trips. Sometimes it was Beth Barenthaver, sometimes it was actually me, but very, very often it was Linda and David Shin. Dave's last field trip never happened. In June of 2022, when we were at Yuba Pass, he had a seizure in the hotel early Saturday morning and ended up at the Grass Valley Hospital. I had a phone call from Linda just a couple weeks ago on the 19th. Dave passed away that Monday night, the 18th, and 8 of us from the Audubon chapter attended his burial in a cemetery in Antioch in support of Linda. It would have actually been his 79th birthday. So I miss Dave a lot. I had a lot of fun with him. We actually attended a car show in Shadelands in June, but in July, things started going downhill very fast. So we offer our love and our support to Linda and Dave's family. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh, for that heartfelt memory and sharing that with all of us. I'm going to ask Matt, our current field trips chair, to give an announcement.
Hello, and thank you, Hugh, for remembering Dave. He was a wonderful man, and he touched a lot of us. On field trips, I actually have 2 announcements. The first is related to the field trip scheduled to Lodi Lake that was originally on October 26th. Just as the last quail was going to press with that date, we realized that was a conflict with the Creek Symposium that Jerry mentioned. And we don't want to get in the way we want as many people as possible to be able to attend the Creek Symposium. So we got together and that Lodi Lake trip has been pushed back to November 15th. And it will be advertised again in the next quail. And the second announcement is just about how to sign up for field trips in general, because I've had a few questions over recent months. People have sometimes been frustrated that they have trouble with Eventbrite, or they try to sign up and the trip is already full. So just quickly, as the field trips chair, my philosophy on the field trips is that the primary purpose is to provide an opportunity for our members, our MDAS members, to get out birding. The secondary purpose, which is also important, is as a form of public outreach and education to non-members. That's how I came to MDAS myself in the first place, was by attending field trips as a non-member. And I think I know some of our new members have joined the same way. So I want to keep that option open too. So the way it's going to work for now, to try it, because I believe that MDAS members should have first crack at the limited number of spots, is that the trip sign up is going to open when the quail publishes. So if you see a trip on the website and it's not open for registration yet, well, it should open at the same time the quail publishes. And the reason for that is I know a lot of people look to the quail to see where our field trips are going to be. So I thought if we time it that way, it would help our members to get the first crack at sign up. Now, for a week or 2 or 3, depending on the exact timing, members should be the only ones able to sign up. A week before the field trip, there's going to be a second tier of tickets that opens up to non-members. And I say tickets, but they're all free. You don't have to pay for any of these tickets. You just have to go through the Eventbrite process to sign up for. So a week before the field trip, it will open up to the public. And if you're kind of on the fence, not sure if you want to go or not, and you say, oh, I can wait, I don't need to sign up now, there's still a dozen spots left. Well, if you get back to that, you get to a week out and it opens up to the public, those spots might go quickly. So keep that in mind. That's how it's going to work. Watch for the quail for the announcement of the field trip. And that's when registration should open for members. And then a week before the trip actually happens, it will open up to non-members. So that's how that works. If you have any questions about it, the email is mdasfieldtrips@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to sort you out. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for your leadership with the field trips. And Rochelle.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Fortier, the membership chair. I'm here to talk about our open board positions, and if you might consider volunteering for one of our open board positions, here are some brief descriptions. We have a secretary position, takes the minutes at our board meetings, which are held 10 times a year. Currently, our board meetings are on Zoom. Education organizes educational activities such as birding classes and outreach to schools in the community, updates our birding brochures. Quail newsletter editor, but note we do have a current volunteer who only has the time to format our newsletter, but we really need a volunteer who does have the time to be on the board, initiate ideas about articles, do editing and proofing. The newsletter is formatted using MailChimp. We have member at large position, provides feedback and new ideas. Hospitality, very important at our in-person meetings for the coffee, the tablecloths, paper plates, and all that. And last, the outreach coordinator, also important, organizes volunteers for our tabling events, usually held in summer and early fall at our local festivals, as well as recruiting potential volunteers for other projects. So I hope you will consider volunteering. If you have questions or if you're interested, I'll put our emails. You could go to our website to click on mine or Jerry's or Ariana's emails. And I'll put our emails in the chat. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rochelle. All right, so now we can get to our main program this evening. We have an exciting program about why birds flock from Jessica Griffiths, who is a wildlife biologist who's been working for the last 20 years here in California and studying songbirds and monarch butterflies. She's currently a wildlife biologist at Colorado State University's Environmental Management of Military Lands at Vandenberg Space Force Base. So please join me in welcoming Jessica. Take it away.
Thank you, Ariana, so much for that introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. So let me take a minute to share my screen. Okay, get this presentation going. Okay, there we go. Okay, just arrange all my little windows here. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about why birds flock. I will start off by saying I almost called this presentation What the Flock, but thought it might be inappropriate. So let's move on. So flocks are a really unique spectacle of nature, and they can be huge and dazzling, like this flock of starlings, which is fleeing from a peregrine falcon. They can be loud and raucous, like a flock of crows, or they can be beautiful and even mysterious, like a flock of geese flying in the night. And so for a really long time, flocking birds have captured our imagination. But why do they actually do it, and what is the science behind flocking? Let's start with something really basic, which is what are the advantages and disadvantages of flocking? Why do birds do it? So there are costs and benefits to all of the behaviors that animals undertake, and flocking is no different. So let's start with the benefits. Flocking together results in cooperative foraging, right? Birds can forage together and work together to find food. They can also share information with each other about where food resources are located, where water is, even where predators are, and where safe shelter is. There's also, relatedly, safety in numbers, right? Protection from predators. With many eyes looking out for predators, birds can spend more time foraging together. It might be easier to find a mate when you've got a whole group of animals all together. So birds that flock together may be able to spend less time looking for a mate. Of course, there are also costs to this, right? While birds are foraging together, this also might result in increased competition for food. There's also potentially a higher risk of disease, right? Anytime you get a group of animals together, there's a risk for disease to spread. I mean, unfortunately, we all learned that the hard way over the pandemic. There could be increased aggression in between birds as they compete for these resources. So the ultimate kind of question that every bird has to answer is, do the costs outweigh the benefits? And if the answer is yes, then the birds will flock together. So it's really, when you come down to it, birds are accountants by nature, right? They need to figure out what's going to work for them the best. So today, we're going to touch on 4 topics, sort of 4 main reasons that birds flock together. We're going to cover migration, foraging, information exchange, and safety. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. So migration. Okay, now when most people think of flocks of birds, a lot of time they think of that typical V-shaped flock of geese or ducks. So let's talk about how and why this happens. So generally, the birds that are migrating together in flocks are large-bodied birds. Think waterfowl, right? Geese, ducks, cranes, swans. These birds are heavy and they need extra lift to get in the air. So really, it's all about energetics. This V formation generates extra lift for birds that are behind the wingtips of the leader, and those birds that are following do less work. Now, that leader bird does more work, but then eventually they switch. So if you follow a flock of birds migrating long enough, you'll see that that lead bird will eventually drop back into the flock and a different bird will take its place. So they take turns doing the more intense work, and they take turns riding each other's drafts. It's really the same principle as cyclists, right? If you've ever watched the Tour de France, you see all those cyclists riding in the draft of the leader. It's very, very similar to that. And this very specific V-shaped formation results in birds saving up to 40% of their energy. So those birds at the back are really getting huge benefits. And we actually know a lot about the energetics of how birds flock because of some really cool research that was done. So one study was done by, the lead researcher was last name Portugal. They conducted a study examining exactly how these large flocking birds derive benefits from flying in this formation. So they studied northern bald-faced ibises. Honestly, a face only a mother could love, right? I think they look awesome. So what the researchers did is they actually raised 14 juvenile ibises and trained them to follow a light plane. And then every bird was fitted with a backpack containing a specially built GPS and inertial measurement device. So what this did was the backpack basically measured the exact location of the bird plus its speed and when and how hard they flap their wings. So all of this data was being recorded as the birds fly. And then they trained the birds to fly and follow this light plane. So I actually have a video. There's no sound to the video, but this video was filmed from the light plane, and you can see all the ibises there. You can see the kind of tire of the plane in the foreground there. So here are all the ibises, and they're flying. Notice how they're staggered, flying one behind the other. And the birds would fly in a V. We're seeing one half of the V right now. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what were the results of the study? So I copied and pasted a figure from the paper, and what they learned is that the birds will actually change the way that they flap their wings based on their position. So when the birds are flying in a staggered position, right, when they're when the bird that's behind is offset a little, as you see on the left, those two birds will phase or synchronize their wing beats, right? So they're flapping, the bird in back is flapping at the same time as the bird in front. This maximizes the beneficial capture of this upwash of air. However, if the bird in back was flying directly behind the bird in front, it will anti-phase, or basically unsync, its wing beats. So when that bird has its wings up, the bird in back will have its wings down. And that avoids detrimental downwash of air. So the birds will actually change exactly how they're riding those currents depending on their position. What's also interesting is that the birds actually moved around within the flock. So this picture shows the position of each of the 14 birds. So there are 14 little crescents here. And that gray color represents kind of the pooled GPS positions of all of the birds in the flock. And then each of those little color splotches is the position of a single bird. So what you might notice is that two things. One, they do move around a lot, but sometimes they actually have a preference for where they spend their time. So for instance, if you look in the second row in the middle, that bird, that color blob, is only on the left side. So that bird liked to fly on the left side of the flock. Meanwhile, the bird below it, right in the middle, that bird is mostly in the center or on the right side of the flock. Some birds didn't have a preference while some did, but you can see how much they move around. So this really fine scale level of detail was very eye-opening. We've never gotten this data before, and it really shows how the birds are moving around within the flock. And last but not least, we learned that the birds had to learn how to flap optimally. They didn't do it at first, right? They had to learn that if you're flying offset, you sync your wings, and if you're flying directly behind, you don't sync your wings. They didn't have an adult bird to learn from. They were following a human in a plane. So they basically learned kind of on their own and from watching each other. So truly fascinating. So the next time you see birds flying in a V formation, you'll know exactly how much work and the mental calculus they're doing to save energy. Okay, let's move on and talk about foraging and flocks. One of the most important reasons to join a flock is to improve foraging success, right? To be able to find food better and faster. Foraging efficiency, or the rate and success rate that you find food, increases in a flock if you've got other birds around. And that's because birds can watch their flock mates and actually learn the location of hidden food items and how best to get that food. Each individual bird can also spend less time watching for predators, right? Because there are many different sets of eyes, and so they can spend less time looking around and being vigilant and more time foraging. And they can grab prey or food items that are flushed or missed by another bird in the flock. So one example here, I've got a picture of ground hornbills in Africa. They walk in a group, and you might think the bird that walks in front is going to get all of the food, but that bird might actually flush a little critter, a lizard, an animal that will run behind it. The birds in back will snap up that prey item. So it works for everybody in the flock. Another benefit to foraging is that some birds will actually employ cooperative hunting. A really great example of this is American white pelicans. Where I live in San Luis Obispo in South County, there's a lake called Oso Flaco. We have white pelicans on this lake, and you can actually watch them. They will surround a school of fish and start from the outside and scoop towards the center with their bills, all kind of herding the fish or the prey into the center there and working together. And I love this picture because if you look closely, you'll see that cormorant hanging out in the sweet spot. That cormorant has it figured out, right? All the fish are just coming right to it. So up until now, we've only been talking about flocks composed of one species. You know, everybody's familiar with that old saying, right? Birds of a feather flock together. And that's actually rooted in the observation that a lot of times large flocks of birds are often comprised of just one species. But in fact, birds do form flocks with other species. And one great example of this is what we call a mixed species foraging flock. And this is very specifically a multi-species flock that the birds have formed in order to find food together. So, as you might guess from the name, the flocks are composed of multiple species of birds. And these flocks have increased foraging efficiency, right? They're better able to find food because they're composed of many individuals of different species who are using just slightly different techniques and are able to find kind of different food items. So those flock members can kind of learn from other species how they get food. And these flocks are led by what we call a nuclear species, which attract other birds and actually lead the flock. Now, this does not mean a bird that's been exposed to radiation. Think of it instead as like the nucleus of an atom, right? That species acts as the nucleus of the flock, kind of holding it together. Nuclear species must meet certain characteristics shown on the bottom of the slide there. They are gregarious, right? They're social and they like to form flocks. Oops, sorry. They have conspicuous plumage. They're year-round residents, and they must have an easily recognized alarm call. Sorry, that was a little spoiler. Here on the central coast of California, where I live, our primary nuclear species is chestnut-backed chickadee, right? They meet all of those requirements. They're a permanent year-round resident. After the breeding season is over, they form hierarchical social flocks. They have very bold facial markings, right? Easy to recognize. And they have loud, very recognizable calls. So in our part of California, this is the bird that is going to be leading those flocks. So why would a bird join a multi-species foraging flock? Well, think about migrating birds passing through an area, right? As they journey through, they are often unfamiliar with not only the habitat that they're stopping in, but that specific location. Think about you as a traveler going to a new location, okay? How are you going to find the best food in an unfamiliar place? But think about before Yelp, before cell phones, okay? The way you would do that is you would ask a local, right? You ask somebody who lives there, where do I go? Where's the best burger? Where do I go to get a great burrito, right? So these migrants are doing the same thing. It is beneficial for them to join flocks which are led by local resident birds, remember that nuclear species, because those birds know where the food is, they know where the water is, they know what predators are in the area. They just have that knowledge. So these birds passing through will join up with those flocks and reap the benefits. And it also benefits the chickadees because remember, there's safety in number. The chickadees can then spend less time looking around for predators. So it's really win-win for everybody. Dozens of migrating species have been documented in mixed species foraging flocks in Central California. This is, 6 of the most common that you might see with chickadee flocks. And I know a lot of us birders know that a great way to find unusual or vagrant birds, especially warblers, is to check those mixed species foraging flocks, right? So this time of year, if you're going out birding, especially around here, I go to like riparian areas or oak woodlands and I listen for chickadees, and that's where I go first. I find the chickadees and then I go see who is hanging out with the chickadees. And so that's what you want to do. Check those chickadee flocks because you never know who might be hanging out there with the chickadees. I found some really fun warblers with those mixed species flocks. Now, what's really cool is that mixed species foraging flocks are not just found in North America, they're found in other places on the globe. In the tropics of Central and South America, multi-species foraging flocks are so important that species that flock together have actually evolved matching colors. And these matching colors might function as sort of a badge that increases acceptance by flock members or even a uniform that aids in recognition of those friendly flock species, right? So I'm going to show you guys two examples. In the mountains of Western Panama, the flock uniform is black and yellow. So these are 6 species that forage together so regularly and so commonly that they've got these these uniform colors, right? So they can recognize each other. And these aren't the only 6. There are several more that also have those colors of black, white, and yellow. They all forage together regularly. Now, in the South Central Andes, the team colors are blue and chestnut. Here are 6 species that forage together very regularly, and they have evolved these kind of matching colors. There are several other examples of this throughout very specific regions in Latin America. So it's a really common phenomenon. The birds here, at least in temperate North America, have not evolved anything like this because they are generally participating in those mixed species foraging flocks only for very small portions of the year. But in Latin America, where you have a lot more year-round residents, that multi-species foraging flock is really important to those birds. So that's why you've got this matching colors, but just a pretty neat phenomenon. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again, and we are going to talk a little bit about information exchange. So this is a really important reason for birds to flock together. Okay, I picked this kind of crazy picture here. For many of us birders, this is a really familiar sight in the fall and the winter, right? Dozens, even hundreds of crows gathering together at the end of the day and then flying to a roost together. Well, research has shown that when birds roost together, they are communicating with each other. So the information center hypothesis was kind of put forward by scientists to kind of explain why this might happen. It posits that birds are exchanging valuable information about the location of food resources at the roost. So a really great and classic example of this is the common raven. Okay, so common ravens that discover a carcass one day will return to the carcass the next day, bringing birds with them. So researchers have shown that naive ravens, so birds who don't know where the carcass is, they actually release kind of ravens at the roost who definitely don't know where that carcass is, followed those knowledgeable birds to the carcass the next day. So what that means is there's definite proof that the knowledgeable birds are communicating information to these naive birds. Now, we don't know exactly what it is they're telling them. We don't think they're necessarily like giving them the actual location of the food, like telling them this is where the carcass is. Instead, it might be something more like, I know where food is, so tomorrow morning, follow me. They may be able to communicate like, I have important knowledge, like, hey, you should follow me. And then those birds who don't know where the food is do that. It's pretty cool. Many species of vultures also roost communally and make use of this information exchange. One study looked at Eurasian griffin vultures in southern Israel, and they fitted them with GPS trackers and were able to track all of their movements. Okay, this is a shot of a figure from the paper. The published study shows all of those little red lines making that network. Those are the GPS tracks of all the birds. And the black dots are the carcasses where they fed. They followed 200 vultures over a 5-year period. So they got an amazing picture of what the birds were doing. And they found that the birds who had found a carcass, they called informed birds, returned to the roost, and then the next day they were followed by uninformed birds to the carcass. So similar to the ravens, those vultures are communicating about food resources at the roost. This is another really cool example I found. So red-billed quellias are native to Africa. They're weavers, right, in the weaver family, and they form absolutely massive flocks. Now they breed communally in these really large groups, and this results in lots of juvenile birds. Now what's interesting is when the breeding is over, the adult birds leave, and the juveniles are on their own when they're about 3 weeks old. So now you have all of these young birds they have to learn how to communicate as a group, and they help each other find food. So they form this massive communal roost where they can efficiently exchange information about food. And as a side note, these are one of the most abundant wild birds in the world. It's been estimated there might be up to 1.5 billion red-billed quailias, and they form flocks that might contain millions of birds. They're feeding on grass seed in these kind of open, shrubby grasslands. This photo was captured by a photographer in Kenya of a huge flock visiting a water hole at the same time as a herd of elephants. And the flock was so big and so raucous, it actually startled the elephants away from the watering hole. I mean, if I was trying to drink out of a watering hole and millions of birds came to use it all at the same time, I would probably back away too. So you might be kind of thinking, well, why would a bird willingly share the location of food with other birds? Because those, think about it, those birds are basically competition. So we have a few possibilities. One possibility is that defending the resource from other sort of conspecifics or birds of the same species in the area could be important. So for instance, ravens may take a group of birds from their own roost to a carcass to make sure ravens from a different roost can't feed there, right? They're bringing their posse to that carcass to make sure only they can eat it. Another classic, safety in numbers, right? The time foraging might be safer with many eyes. If you're a raven, you don't necessarily want to be feeding at a carcass all by yourself because you could be vulnerable. So you bring a bunch of your roost buddies and everybody can keep their eyes open. Another possibility is that by demonstrating knowledge of the location of food, a bird may be able to signal that it is a suitable mate, right? We all know smart is sexy. So a bird might be able to kind of demonstrate like, hey, I know how to find food, I'm savvy, and I would be a good mate. So all of these are possible reasons that birds may share info at the roost like that. Okay. Last but not least, we're going to touch on our fourth reason for flocking. This is one of the most important reasons that birds flock together. We've already touched on it a few times during this talk, and that is for safety or protection. This is a photo of a peregrine falcon swooping on a flock of European starlings. This photo was taken in the Central Valley, where there are many, many European starlings. And so you can see this photo really demonstrates how those starlings just form this incredibly dense flock to try and sort of elude and confuse the peregrine falcon. So why do we flock for safety? Why do birds flock for safety? Well, of course, we've talked about this a little bit already, but you've got increased chances of spotting a predator. Okay, right? More birds, more eyeballs, more lookouts. Okay, per bird, each individual bird can spend more time looking for food and feeding and less time looking around and being vigilant. And if one bird makes an alarm call, it'll warn all the birds in the area. So basically everybody's kind of benefiting from this alarm system. A great example of this is ostriches, okay? Ostriches, one of their main predators is lions. So they have to keep an eye out for lions. So at any given time, one bird is playing lookout while all the rest are foraging. You can see that ostrich kind of in the back center there has its head up while all the rest have their head down to feed. Okay, I bet you can think of a local bird that often very conspicuously posts a lookout for the rest of the flock. In fact, I believe you named your newsletter after it. Okay, of course, I'm thinking of the California quail. So a lot of us have seen this behavior, right? Where you have one quail sitting up high on a post while all the rest of the flock is feeding. So they will take turns watching out for the flock. And the bird that's keeping lookout will switch. So when they get hungry, they'll fly down, a different bird will take its place. This allows each bird to spend way more time foraging. Okay, here's our little flock. Okay, evasive maneuvers. If a predator gives chase, a bird in a flock has a lower chance of being caught by that predator. Birds that get separated are more likely to be eaten. And so here is a series of photos by this photographer. His name is Nick Dunlap. That earlier photo I showed you of the starlings evading the peregrines, he took a whole series of incredible photos. And these are all shot in the Central Valley. So I'm just going to kind of show you guys these pictures. Okay. And you get these incredible, in this photo, you can kind of see the very tiny dot where that flock is kind of the darkest in the center near. It looks almost like a tree coming up. Just to the right, you can see the little black dot. That's the peregrine. Okay. Really remarkable. And what's really remarkable is the way that the starlings can actually do this. Okay. How do they do this? How do flocks move in unison like this to avoid a predator? Well, this remained one of just a huge mystery for many years. And a lot of, frankly, pretty bananas theories were put out there. Things like natural telepathy, thought transference, biological radio, disembodied electromagnetic consciousness. I mean, people really truly had absolutely no idea how birds could, they all seem like they're turning at the same time. They must be psychic. Well, it turns out that is not actually true. Instead, it's actually, I think, maybe even more fascinating. So a group of Italian researchers filmed starling flocks in Rome, and they used 3 high-speed cameras, and then they used this really powerful tracking software for analysis. And what they discovered is that each bird in a flock is tracking about 6 to 7 birds around them in the flock. Instead of copying the direction in which a neighbor flies, that the bird is copying how sharply its neighbor turns. That sounds like a fine distinction, but it really makes a difference. So what this means is the kind of message to turn starts from just a few birds, and it can actually sweep through the flock at about 20 to 40 meters per second, which is about 90 miles an hour. What that means is for a flock of 400 birds, it takes about half a second for the entire flock to turn. And these researchers had to do some pretty heavy duty math to figure this out. And the math equations that they actually use to describe the flocking birds are almost identical to the equations that describe the movement of supercooled liquid helium, right? So the birds are almost moving more like a liquid than a solid. Very, very interesting. Anyway, that is how you can get these truly remarkable flock formations. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish, and I will take any questions that people may have. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that I can see everybody. Okay, great. I figure we've got 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
That is so fascinating. It's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing. So I'm curious, is this, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Jessica your question. So I'm curious, with your work at the environmental management of the military, I mean, is that, are they looking at that sort of thing in terms of bird strikes, or is like the relevance to your current job?
Yeah, so I'm working right now at Vandenberg. Vandenberg is not actively looking at like flock movements. Of course, we are very concerned with actually trying to minimize flocking birds around the areas where aircraft are, taking off and leaving. So we have one main airfield runway, and we work to kind of try to minimize groups, especially flocks of really large, potentially collision-prone birds like geese. But we're not doing any active research on flocking at the base. However, we do have, in the winter, we get a lot of, flocking starlings, flocking mixed species flocks of blackbirds. We've got brewers and, red-winged blackbirds and everything. So we have a lot of flocks on base, but we're not doing any active research into that. I myself have done a bunch of just kind of nerding out and looking in the literature because I find it so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And then this is off topic, but I was looking at your bio, and and that you've worked on monarch butterflies. And I just saw the news about them changing the status, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, so monarch butterflies are under consideration by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for listing possibly as federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So they haven't reached an official decision yet. Right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service considers them a candidate species, which means that they're working on deciding whether they should be listed. And I do have a lot of thoughts about it. I do a lot of work with monarchs in my career and have done for the last 20 years. And, you know, it's unfortunate that listing is warranted, because what that means is the population has been decreasing so much that they might really need that protection. However, exactly how the listing is going to work is very complicated, because monarch butterflies are found in all 50 states. Milkweed, which is their host plant, is found everywhere by the side of the road, all over the place. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has actually been working for about, I think 8 years now on this listing, which is possibly the longest it's ever taken them to list a species, because it's so complicated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a big deal. But, you know, we're at Vandenberg Space Force Base. We're located right on the coast. For those of you who don't know, Vandenberg is in northern Santa Barbara County, near the community of Lompoc, kind of right on the coast in northern Santa Barbara County. And we are in the overwintering zone of the monarch butterfly. And so Vandenberg does have multiple monarch butterfly overwintering sites on base. And that's one of the main components of my job, actually, is to work on management plans and recommendations for that habitat, just because they are probably going to be listed. We don't know for sure, but it's looking really likely that they're going to get listed next year. So yeah, I know that there are some people who are kind of against it, because it might mean more rules and regulations on things like teachers having monarchs in classrooms or people raising them in their backyard. But because they're going to be listed as threatened, they can actually, I don't want to get too in the weeds of it, but it's basically not as big a deal or as restrictive as if they were listed as endangered. So there will be kind of like considerations in place when they write the listing, if they do, for things like education and conservation.
Okay, that's good to know. I have a friend who loves to raise the monarchs, and she's a teacher and bring them in. But what I was referring to specifically was the IUCN, the article that was in Science Magazine this week about,
So IUCN designated them as endangered. I got a lot of texts that day, like, monarchs are endangered, because the US government can list things as endangered. IUCN doesn't have any regulatory power in the US. They can only kind of make that designation to kind of raise awareness, which it did. And yeah, I actually thought it was great. I wish that they maybe used a different word than endangered, because the US federal government also uses the word endangered, and it kind of means something different. So
okay, go back to birds, but that's great to hear that, because I saw that article about the IUCN and I immediately sent it to my friend, and I will tell her what you said about the US.
Yeah, that was actually last summer. Well, unless I've missed something, but last summer is when they designated it as endangered, and my phone was like blowing up, and it was
so this thing on October 3rd says that they are going to be now listed as vulnerable. So they got downgraded because somebody challenged so I'll send it to you anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Monarchs are very political.
Okay, so from Valerie.
Okay, back to birds.
Yeah. Did you say what sense the starlings use to recognize how the other birds are turning?
Great. So as far as we can tell, it is vision, right? So they are looking at, within their sphere of vision, they are paying specific attention to, like I said, kind of 6 or 7 birds in their immediate vicinity. So they, as far as we can tell, they're not necessarily using, like, you know, when you think about aquatic animals that live under the water, they may have kind of an electrical sense, or be able to like sense air movements. Birds can sense air currents and things like that with their feathers, right? The feathers are sensitive. Wind blowing on the feathers creates pressure, which travels, down the wing to nerves. So it is possible that they are maybe sensing, the immediate like proximity of those birds, but as far as we can tell, it is vision. That said, we don't know 100% for sure. I almost every answer I'm going to give you guys, I'm going to qualify, because anytime we think we know exactly what's going on, we find out, no, we don't know. But as near as we can tell, it's probably vision.
Cool. Okay. In Ohio, we see horned larks, a resident species, seemingly acting as a nuclear species with Lapland longspurs and snow buntings. Is that reasonable? We also seem to see that we can begin finding migrating warblers when we hear black-capped chickadees.
Yes, totally. Right. So there's all different kinds of nuclear species. And they're found in all different habitats, right? So the horned larks and Lapland, like they're going to be in like those open, like grassland, like really low vegetation, kind of short vegetation fields, things like that. Yes, totally. Right. Horned larks have bold, recognizable markings. They like to form, they're fitting all right. They fit those requirements. They form flocks outside of the breeding season. If they would qualify for nuclear species status, if they are mostly or entirely non-migratory, if they kind of stick around at least through the bulk of the migratory season. So yeah, that's totally possible. And yes, birds in the chickadee family, which is the Paridae, so chickadees and titmice are in North America some of the most common nuclear species. So in other parts of the country, it might be tufted titmouse. It might be like up in the Sierras, mountain chickadees. So it just depends. But as long as they meet those criteria, they could be considered a nuclear species. So yeah, there's all different species could fill that role depending on where you are and what habitat you're in. That's a great observation.
I've been so intrigued by this flocking behavior for a long time, so I really enjoyed your information. I finally got to see swifts going into chimneys in large groups recently. It's that swift movement of flocks that's amazing. That's what's called murmuration. I probably said it wrong.
Oh, so I think technically, starlings, a group of starlings is a murmuration, if you want to be super pedantic about it. That's the word for like those big giant flocks of starlings, but swifts are a super great example. I finally got to go to the Portland area a few years ago and see the chimney swifts coming into like the old chimney. I can't remember exactly what it's called. There's like a school that has like this smokestack, and like it's this 2-week period. The local Audubon chapter there organizes these sunset viewings, and you can go and watch thousands and thousands of birds. But the way that they are swooping and flying together, right? It's really similar. Like they're using the same, I guess, techniques, and they're also doing it for the same reasons, right? Multiple, by having so many birds in a flock, they're protected. But that's really cool. Yeah, swifts are another great example of a bird that can form just massive flocks.
Have there been studies of flocking behavior of robins? Earlier this year, I had a flock in my backyard eating the privet berries. One bird seemed to be on the outside branch looking around. A Cooper's hawk zoomed towards the privet bushes, and the robin on the lookout made a chirp, and the entire flock flew off in different directions.
Awesome. That's so cool you got to see that. So yes, I don't know of any papers that have addressed robins specifically. That doesn't mean that there aren't any. I mean, oh my God, there's so many papers to look at. However, what you just observed is like classic, like one individual is being vigilant, right? They're playing that role of lookout while the others forage, and the lookout did its job, right? That bird gave the alarm, and all the other birds were able to like escape. So that's really awesome. Tons of birds do that. It's a super common behavior because it works, right? It provides, it's a kind of a straightforward benefit that you don't want to necessarily be by yourself looking for food because yeah, you're vulnerable. What if it was just one robin, think about it. They would have to either be constantly raising their head to look for Cooper's hawks and not get very much time eating berries, or focus on eating berries and maybe get eaten by a Cooper's hawk. So yeah, that's an awesome behavior that you saw. Very cool.
Anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to unmute or put them in the chat. Okay, we have another one. We watched a massive flock of snow geese flocking in a susurration that consumes. We had not been aware that such large groups, I guess.
Yeah, so waterfowl, right? And with waterfowl, at Casumnes, that's really cool. Right? The Central Valley is like a great place for migrating and flocking waterfowl, especially in the fall and winter. You get, I actually haven't been to see the snow geese in the Central Valley, which is crazy because I don't live that far from it. But they are flocking together for the same reason. And what's really cool is that waterbirds, a lot of waterbirds will actually do something called a molt migration, where they will actually migrate to a very specific and protected place, and they will molt their feathers. And while they do this, they're very vulnerable. And so they do it in huge flocks, right? Because again, it's the same principle, safety in numbers. That's not necessarily to say that the geese at Casumnes are doing that right now, but they are, and the geese will react to, geese aren't really in danger from something like a peregrine falcon. They're too big, but they might be vulnerable to a land-based predator like a coyote. And so, but it's the same principle. They are flocking in huge numbers. They're also taking advantage of winter food resources. And clearly there's, enough to go around. Okay. I see the question in the chat about, Ariane, you want to read the question in the chat about bush tits?
Are bush tits considered a nuclear flocking species? They have a distinctive alarm call when a Cooper's hawk flies by.
Okay, this is such a good question. And I would actually have to say that the answer is, it's kind of, but it's really no. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that bush tits forage so quickly through an area. I have watched this a million times. They forage extremely rapidly through an area, and they will often just leave other birds in the dust. Like they come sort of sweeping through, foraging, and then move on. So it would seem like they would be a good fit in that they're year-round residents, they flock, right? They're locals, they have a distinct alarm call. However, what I have observed is a lot of times you'll get just a flock of bush tits, like over here, you get a mixed species foraging flock, and then sometimes they'll meet, right? You may have this giant mixed species foraging flock that includes bush tits, but if you watch long enough, eventually those bush tits are going to separate and move on. So they don't really stick with the flock. I don't exactly know why that is, if it's just the way that they are. They also don't have one of the qualifications for a nuclear species is that they have really bold markings. And I will say bush tits don't have very bold markings, right? They're kind of plain, which works for them. But I think that their foraging style and their strategy of just kind of sweeping through an area very rapidly just doesn't mesh with the way that a lot of other birds forage. So in my observations, they're not a true nuclear species. That does not mean to say that other birds don't necessarily join their flocks, because I've definitely seen that. I've definitely seen other birds foraging with bush tits for sure. However, I think that they're just not quite a good match. So, I could be wrong. I don't know if there's literature out there that says they kind of officially are, but in my many years of observing them, I found that they just don't, they don't quite meet all the qualifications for an actual nuclear species.
And I was curious with the slide you had of the coevolution of the colors for the mixed species flocks.
Yeah.
Is that male and female birds? Because they're so bright that I'm like, are they males?
To my knowledge, yes. And actually, in the tropics, the kind of, this isn't universally true, but a lot of times females aren't quite necessarily as drab as they are here. In temperate regions, sexual dimorphism has evolved not just in plumage, but in the actual roles that the birds play during the breeding season, right? So in a lot of our songbirds, you have the female is on the nest incubating. Not all of them, but a lot of them. The female's incubating while the male is defending the territory. It's like a division of labor. And so the males will very usually be very brightly colored. They have a loud and complicated song. They're really easy to identify. Meanwhile, the females don't sing as much, and they have much drabber coloration in order to blend in. In the tropics, we see less of that. So that's not to say that males and females don't have different plumage, but that division of labor where you've got only one sex doing this thing and only the other sex doing the other thing just doesn't exist. And part of that is because resources are often not as limited in the tropics. In a lot of parts of temperate North America, the breeding season is short and resources are limited. So the birds have to like maximize their efficiency, and they do that by splitting up who does what. In the tropics, it's not so much the case. So as far as I know, that is males and females. That was a really long-winded way of answering that question. But yes, both sexes have those colors.
And you said that in the tropics that they will do the mixed species flocking for a longer time.
Yes. Yeah, here it really is like the breeding season is short. Migration is a short period of time on either end. So the amount of time that birds are spending sometimes in those flocks can be really short. On the wintering grounds, they might be hanging out. But yeah, those mixed species foraging flocks are so important for such a significant portion of their life cycle that they've co-evolved those colors. So there's external selective pressure that is influencing that. So we know how that tells us that those associations that they're forming, those assemblages, are very critical to them.
And I'm also curious, I was reading about the golden winged warblers and how they have flocks of all females and all males, and that's impacted conservation status or conservation plans because more time and energy is focused on the males. And so then the females are getting left out of the conservation one. So I'm curious if any research on like why all the males are flocking together and all the females. And
that's actually really cool. And I will fully admit, I did not actually know that. So I need to make a note to actually look into that and maybe add maybe add a slide or two, because that's really fascinating. Again, there must, it didn't happen for no reason. Like there must have been some kind of selective pressure to cause that to be a behavior that, they do. So whether, I don't know what that would be. I'm actually really curious about that. I really want to look into that. But yeah, I'm not sure. That's super cool.
Yeah. Have you heard of the Galbatross project? It's like a effort now to have more focus on female birds. And so I think that was where I read about it.
Yes. And actually I was talking about, I mentioned bird song earlier, how like in North America, a lot of times it's like, oh, the male birds are doing a lot of the singing. Well, there's actually a project called the Female Songbird Project, which is aiming to kind of bring to light the fact that actually in North America, there's actually dozens, even hundreds of species where female birds actually do sing. And it's actually very common in the tropics that female birds do sing, because we don't have that, like I said, that kind of division of labor that you see in temperate North America. So female birds have been really understudied. Females of a lot of species have been really understudied. Birds in particular, because at least in North America, the male birds are just so visible. Like there they are, they're out there. They're the ones who are out there, the ones who are singing. So a lot of the attention gets focused on them. And, I think, I don't know a nice way to say it, but as more women started becoming scientists and going out into the field, they were like, did you guys like notice actually that female birds are singing, that actually female birds are doing that, female animals are doing this, whatever. Like it just has kind of taken that kind of shift, I guess, in demographics of the career. But it's really interesting. Anyway, yes, I did not know that, and now I want to read about it.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you. And I think Rosalie added in the chat Audubon's coverage of it in their magazine.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look at the chat.
Okay, Rochelle, we have suit on a tray that attracts bush tits. I have heard that I've heard the bush tits twittering in a different weird sound in our bush when the Cooper's hawk was taking a drink from our bird bath nearby.
Yes, so this is actually really cool. A lot of birds, and particularly birds, flocking species, right? Bush tits, chickadees, titmice, they will actually have birds that are habitually flocking with each other, have very well developed alarm calls. And not only are the alarm calls loud and recognizable, they also contain information. So the birds will make a different alarm call based on the kind of predator and where the predator is located. There was a study that was done, and I cannot remember. I actually want to say it was chickadees, and I can't remember what species of chickadee. It's possible it was like tits in the old world, like in Europe, but it was like the chickadee family where they actually kind of, I guess, described and quantified the types of calls that birds were making in response to different predators. And they were discovered there's one call that they use for a predator that's coming from the ground, a different call that is a predator that's coming like from the sky, a different call actually for like very specific predators like people, or so they are communicating information in those vocalizations to each other. So that is a super great observation. In fact, and those of you who've developed an ear while birding, I've actually honed in on predators, especially when accipiters like Coopers or Sharpshins, I'll be watching and all of a sudden I'll hear the bush tits give a very specific high pitch, like it's a super recognizable alarm call. And I'll be like, oh, I'll look around and like, oh yeah, look, there's a accipiter that I didn't even know was there. And the bush tits told me it was there. So that's a really cool observation.
Nice. Often the male warblers will migrate ahead of the female warblers by a week or two, so the flocks during migration will be gender specific by virtue of timing of migration.
Yes, and so I don't know if the golden wing warbler flocks are happening during migration, if those are like post-breeding flocks or pre-breeding flocks, or if they're on the overwintering grounds or whatever, but great observation. Yeah, the male birds will leave first because they're actually going down to the overwintering grounds a lot of times and establishing territories down there. So it's like a race to get down there as well. And the adult birds, adult males will leave first, then the adult females, and then the juveniles last. So a lot of times all the nice looking adults will be gone and all you're looking at are, you know, first year birds, they're left behind and they're going to migrate on their own. They have to figure it out. Basically, it's really interesting.
Great. Well, I know we can't keep you forever.
Okay. Oh yeah.
So good.
I do
Sorry.
need to jump off soon. That's
Okay,
okay. It's
well,
okay. It was
anyway.
great. You guys had such awesome questions and I tend to answer in a very long-winded way. So
No, this was so fascinating. We all learned so much. So thank you so much for doing this presentation for us. We really appreciate it.
thank you so much for inviting me. It was wonderful to talk to you guys.
Thank you, Jessica.
I had a great time. And again, you had super great questions.
Okay, cool. All right, well, that's it for our October meeting. Okay, so November, we're in person, and I know I just looked this up, but let me make sure I don't get it wrong. So November, we are in the Don Tatson Community Hall at the Lafayette Library, and our speaker going to be Dan Fitzgerald and Dan Sandry from the Mount Diablo Interpretive Association, so we'll learn lots of natural history about Mount Diablo State Park. So thank you, and we'll see you in person next month. Night.